Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight in this class. We are continuing tonight our look in Romans. And we have been in Romans chapter 7 for a couple of classes now. And we dealt with Paul's example of the woman who is married to a husband, and that she is bound by law to her husband. And Paul makes very specific that the law and the husband are one and the same, and that the only means of deliverance from the bondage, as he says, bound to that, binding to that husband, binding to that law of her husband, is for that husband to die. Now, I'm not going to rehash the things that we've said in these first 5 or 6 verses, because I want to get into verse 7. But with what we're going to say for the rest of this chapter, the previous verses are very important to keep in mind as we look at Paul basically using himself as an example of what he has just laid out in this picture of a woman married to this husband. He's going to give his own personal experience as a man under the law of Moses, yet still governed by the law of the first husband, because we're not talking, as we've said in the past, Paul is not speaking of himself as a Christian who is having difficulty living for God. He is speaking as a man who is yet to receive the life of Christ, yet has a testimony set before him, a God-given testimony, a divine law given of God that is a picture and a perfect presentation in testimony of that life that he is void of in and of himself, yet attempting, and we'll see what motivates that attempt as we go on in this, but attempting to take the letter that is a testimony of spirit, of life, of perfection, and apply it to that which is contrary in all points, contrary to the testimony itself that he is trying to fulfill by works and obedience to religious or obedience to law. So I'm going to start in verse 7. And again, keep in mind the example of the woman married to the husband. Keep that in mind. That's very important, because this is what Paul's basically demonstrating through the rest of this verse, or this chapter. Romans 7, starting in verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. We'll stop in verse 9 there. The preceding argument, as I've said before, is very important. What he's just laid out in this example with the woman and her husband. And based upon that, he asked the question, what shall we say? Is the law now sin? Is the law not just the law sin, but is law the catalyst for sin? Is it the means of sin? And he says, God forbid, let it not be so. And the previous example of the marriage between the woman and the first husband, it undeniably answers that question. But now Paul will answer, giving his own experience under the law of Moses. And again, I say, he gives his example as one under the law of Moses, which was a testimony of a perfect man. But yet, even under that perfect law, still inwardly governed by the law of the man of sin, the first husband. This is a man not born again, yet under the law, that testifies of the life he would receive when he is born again. Void of life, void of righteousness, void of all that is embodied in the life of a perfect man. And the thing we have to understand in this, and I think that's why most people look at these chapters, verses 7 down, seeing a Christian who's having struggles, is because that's the way we see salvation. And basically that's the way we look at Paul's examples here. But he is not talking about a salvation that basically initiates a process of elimination. It doesn't start some process of elimination where we get rid of one and, well, the more we get rid of the one, the more of the other can come in. Now, I know we throw out the verse, he must increase and I may decrease. But in the context of that, we can't say that is a declaration of of a personal experience of salvation. It is a man it is John who is the representative of the law, and the prophets testified unto John. And John said, his increase is my decrease. The coming of the substance of that testimony of the law and the prophets means that everything I represent comes to its fulfillment, comes to its end. That was John saying that. We say that because we think it's some process of eliminating the bad and then getting more of the good. Or the more good comes in, the more bad is displaced. The displacement comes when he comes in. The two cannot coexist. These two men, as Paul will say it in Galatians 5, very simply, and it's the same contrast that he's making here. Flesh and spirit. They do not cooperate together. They do not work together. And bitter and sweet, as James will say, cannot be in the same fountain. We must understand that this is not a cohabiting of Adam and Christ to where one finally wins out. Being born again means you are born of one seed. And John will say very plainly, and this is why we stumble on this verse, because we look at ourselves to define it. He will say, one who is born of the seed of God, born again, does not sin, does not commit sin. That brings you right here into these verses. It's a state that he speaks of. Living continually in a state of sin. Shall we continue in sin? As he says in chapter 6. The one who is born of God does not sin, for the seed is in him. And such a heredity, as one translation says, cannot sin, cannot miss the mark, cannot fall short of glory. Why? Because the seed that is in you is the glory. Is the very perfect life that you, or Paul will describe right here, that he tried to produce or perform or bear the fruit of, but yet lacked the life in which that fruit was found. There's only one life in which perfect righteousness exists, and that life is Christ. And if Christ is in you, then perfect righteousness is in you. The question is your soul beholding him as perfect righteousness, or are you still looking at yourself to try to find that? There's a transformation, meaning it's the soul that is translated or brought from looking at one form to another, the form that once, a familiar form that once defined reality for us, to the form that God reveals in the presence of his Son and as his Son. So it is not a process of elimination. Salvation is a soul married to another man, thereby being delivered from our previous, as he says it in different ways, our previous enslavement, our previous marriage, the bondage to the first man, to the old man. Knowing this, our old man is crucified. The salvation, that is a finished work, a once and for all transaction that the soul is ever knowing, experiencing. But the work of God is done as far as the reality of it being present. That is the liberty, the deliverance Paul will cry out for in these verses, but that we have come to in Christ, delivered. You are now delivered from this marriage. Free, that you should be married to another, even to him that is raised from the dead, so that you now can bear fruit unto God. Fruit that God receives, fruit that actually glorifies the Father. So, we'll look at this verse, this phrase first. Is the law sin? Spiritual aim of the law makes it impossible for us in ourselves, in our activities, in perfect obedience to the letter of the law, to ever reach that goal while still under the government of sin. Didn't matter how well you did it, how perfectly you obeyed it. It was the life out from which those things were done. It's the source, it's the seed, it's the life, the man to whom the soul is married. That determines everything. That determines the fruit. That determines everything. Sin can look beautiful. Sin can be the most beautiful works of the flesh, but it's still the works of the flesh. It's things that Paul once looked at and deemed to be holy and righteous, as of great value and gain as far as his relation to God. But in the knowing of Christ now, the new man, the life, the righteousness that God had bestowed in grace, he now sees it as dung, as nothing, as sin. And that's a lot of times, that's what he focuses on and looks at, as the works of darkness. It's not sin. The law is not sin, but it does shine a great spotlight. It exposes the sin that is already there in us. We'll get into the phrase, I could not know the law, I could not know sin. And basically saying I couldn't know the law of sin that governed me unless the law declared a perfection that could only be found in another, and gave a great contrast to who I am. We read the letter, we read this book many times trying to see the reflection of our own face. Or at least a testimony that our face can give reflection to at some point in time. But there's only one face in which the substance of these words can ever be known and ever be realized. And that one is in us as the gift of God, as the gift of grace. Not of works, lest any man should boast. And Paul's going to show that the sin that is in man motivates him toward a spiritual goal, so that he may boast in his result, in his accomplishments. Accomplishment that Paul will show us never actually happens, but man can make it. Man can assume great accomplishment in things that are empty, vain. So this brings us back to our previous sessions that we had. I don't know if we had them in these classes about Romans, but the previous sessions we had, and we looked at the giving of the law, how God gave the law to his people in Exodus, and I'm not going to stay on this very long, but we read, thou shalt not, and in the Hebrew it's just not that way. In the Hebrew it's actually, you do not, you cannot. He is not giving them demands. The Hebrew language does not make it a demand that God gives toward His people. A law basically was an affirmation, an affirmative declaration declaring Israel His son and clothing His people with a testimonial garment within which context God would know them and deal with them and relate to them. And as long as they lived within that testimonial context of the one that He declares, of the one whose nature He declares as their very garment, you do not. You cannot. This is not you. This is not who you are. You're perfect. You're perfect. Your righteousness complete. As long as they walk within the context of that, of a testimony of a perfect life, He would deal with them. If not, they were outside of the confines of Israel. Their relationship was cut off. And that is not about, well, if I don't do it right, then God cuts me off. No, it's either His son or nothing. His son. Israel is my son. Again, look at the law as a declaration of a perfect son, a perfect man. If we are not found in Him, we are not found. If He is not our life, we have no life. If He is not our salvation, we have no life before God, no righteousness, and no relationship with God at all. And we do not, God does not give us His beloved Son so that we would in that Son have a potential to achieve spiritual life or spiritual whatever, any spiritual end. He gives His Son, His beloved Son, to the soul as His spiritual end, as His goal, as His intention realized and fulfilled. He calls the soul in which He dwells to know that perfect life, that perfect man. This is God giving a picture of a man when He gives the law, in which His absolute delight is found and His righteousness is embodied and personified. See, that's why in Matthew 5, Jesus comes and He basically gives this tremendous culmination of Exodus, of the giving of the law, the whole of the law. And He does so by presenting the fulfillment of the law and the righteousness that exceeds that of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees as something beyond perfect deeds. As not committing adultery, not fornicating, not taking the Lord's name in vain, not coveting. He takes it beyond the scope of activity, out of the scope of sight and sound, where men can look and assess the deeds or the lack thereof and say they're fulfilling the law or they're not. He takes it beyond that because the law was never about that. And we still look today at those things, and we look for the reality of righteousness, holiness in that same framework. And Christ comes and takes it out of that framework and brings it right into the soul. He makes it an inward thing, not something you do or don't do. Because what you do or don't do has a source. And He's showing them it doesn't matter what you do or do not do. Perfect obedience to law does not equate a perfect life. Paul will say in Philippians that touching the righteousness in the law, he was blameless. And then in Romans 7, he will say, wretched man I am. That's the same man under the same law. Doing what it says, but never capable of being the one of whom it speaks. The life is what matters. So he takes it out of the realm of outward deeds done and effects of perfect adherence to law. And he says, if you even look upon a woman to lust, inward. If you're angry, not just committing murder, that's not the thing. It's about the source that would cause such an action. Do you have a life that cannot even conceive anger so that product of murder never gets accomplished? Do you have a nature that does not even have the thought of lust, cannot even conceive lust in the heart? So the action of adultery or all of those things cannot happen, will not happen, has no groundwork or ground to happen. See, he's posing something far more than we have conceived. And it's not a greater condemning law. It's declaring a greater life than we imagined. A greater perfection, a greater righteousness than we ever thought. Not a righteousness we can point to and say, that's what it looks like. But a righteousness that is so perfect and so real that only God Himself can show that righteousness. Natural eye can't behold it. Natural ears can't hear it. A natural mind can't conceive it. God reveals that righteousness because it is a righteousness beyond the scope of sight and sound, beyond the scope of human flesh and blood. It is real. And it has no imitation. There's nothing comparable to it. And if you conceived it with your natural mind to give any inclination of what it looks like or a definition, you're wrong. God must reveal this reality. This is the whole basis. See, Paul was attempting to achieve a righteousness he sees in the letter. But it was only when the newness of life, the newness of spirit, meaning the spirit of the letter comes and dwells in his soul, that perfect righteousness he attempted to achieve could actually be realized. Because perfect works do not overcome inward condition. Is the law sin? No, the law is perfection. The law is a testimony of a perfect, divine person. So it's from this premise that we look at Paul's question and his statement. The issue is not one of the law being bad or sin, but the goodness of the law's testimony never being reached or never capable of being reached due to the internal incapacity of the Adamic man. The zeal of their heart towards a good law, doing what it says, the passionate desire toward fulfilling God's goal and His aim cannot overcome, Paul will show, the internal condition of sin and death. The fruit of the seed will always and only be of the nature of the seed. Again, we cannot. I had such a hard time with those verses, such a hard time taking those things outside of myself, taking those things, allowing God to bring these words outside of the context of me and define them in another. Because all that I could see was myself. So when you say, he that is born of God cannot sin, I say, that's not true. But see, when you realize that he is not declaring some state that you possess in and of yourself, he's declaring the reality determined by the seed that remains in him. See that? It's not determined by you or me. It's determined by the seed that abides in us. And if we would come to know the source that is in us, the life that is present, and that comes by the revealing of that life, the revealing of that Son. But it does not make that Son more than he already is in us. It just makes the soul aware and cognizant and come to the acknowledgement of who he is within us presently by birth. Then not I but Christ begins to govern all things. That's where you come the moment you're born again. Not I, but Christ. The seed lives in me. Not I, but the seed. Not I, but Christ liveth in me. That seed determines everything. Because he, again, is not saying you won't do stupid things, won't do bad things. He's saying the seed ensures that your state is one of perfect righteousness. Whether you know it in its perfection or not. The knowing of that one who's in you will ensure that that reality that he is begins to govern everything else. But what I'm declaring to you, what I'm trying to tell you, is that that's a reality before you come to know it, before you come to live in the light of it or enjoyment of it. New birth has made it so. The presence of his life makes it so. And that's why you can stand upon the sure ground that Paul presents in almost every letter saying, since you're risen with Christ, set your heart above. Because your life, the reality of your life is hidden with Christ in God. And that life must be revealed. And when that life appears, you will see that which has always been from the moment of birth. You will see you have been with him in glory from the moment Christ in you, the hope of glory, came to reside in you. And you don't have to go after all of these other things, law and religious zeal and effort, as he poses in chapter 2, to find it. You find it in the person of Christ in you. And you know it in the revealing of that one. So, Paul goes on to say, I would not have known sin except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Again, this paints the picture that the law presents to man. The law presents a great dilemma to man too, because it presents the most perfect righteousness required of God. Perfect man who God delights in. But it also leaves man without any capacity toward those requirements. Because although the law had a spiritual end in view, it leaves man void of the life or the newness of life in which true righteousness is realized. And see, that's covered further in chapter 8 when Paul says the law was weak through the flesh. The law was weak through the flesh. In that the law was weak through God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, condemned sin in the flesh. That's the cross, where he put away the first man. He put away the weakness of that man. He put away the contrariness or the contrariety of that man. That man in all points contradictory to God's eternal end. He put that man away. He didn't teach that man how to be good. He didn't give him potential to be better. He put that man away. So that what? The righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. How does that happen? Married to another man, that you might bring forth fruit unto God. Same thing. He's just showing the transaction that made that so. It's the life. The law of the Spirit of life hath made me free from the law of sin and death. It is knowing him in the power of his resurrection and being thus made conformable to his death. It's knowing the reality and the presence of the new, that we may stop at all stop looking for anything of reality outside of that man. The newness of life that has come. The perfect man of righteousness. In Romans 8, and we'll get into this when we get into Romans 8, but when he says that law was weak through the flesh, this is from the Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary. He says, it is not rendered because of the flesh, as an English reader might suppose, but through the medium of the flesh. It was weak through the medium of the flesh. And so he does, i.e., or an example, how it should be said, is having to address itself to us through a corrupt nature. Too strong, a corrupt nature, too strong to be influenced by mere commandments and threatenings. Meaning, it wasn't a surface situation that could be remedied because I give you demands, commands, and requirements. That wouldn't fix it. That wouldn't fix it. The nature, again, as this example says, couldn't be fixed by just doing some better stuff. You are married to this man. You were joined, bound to this man and the law that he embodied. Sin, death, corruption. All that he will talk about as the works of the flesh in Galatians 5. That's that man. That man could not be remedied just by doing better stuff. That man had to die. I'm telling you, he's dead. And that salvation is that transaction of dead unto sin, as he says in chapter 6, and alive unto God through Christ Jesus. It is free from the bondage of the law of the first husband and married to another. Now, that is not a process we go through. It is an absolute reality that we are ever knowing and realizing and comprehending in the appearing of our husband, the groom. But it is not something that is yet to be accomplished. Old things are past, and the new has come. Now, not capable of alleviating, I wrote here, this is based upon what we just read in this commentary, having to address itself through corrupt nature, a nature that is too strong to be merely influenced by commandments or threatenings. Couldn't be fixed that way. Again, I wrote, not capable of alleviating the internal condition of bondage to sin. That bondage was only alleviated by the cross, and that's what he goes on to say in Romans 8, 3 and 4. It's alleviated only by the cross. The deliverance is only by the cross, and is the victory and the freedom. It comes by being indwelt by the life in which righteousness dwells. Thus Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to all who believe. He is not the potential for righteousness. He is righteousness, made unto us righteousness. That's what it means that the life determines everything. The life in you determines everything. It's Christ made unto you righteousness, sanctification, redemption, wisdom. This is the wisdom of God. Some translations will say, it is the wisdom of God He's made unto you, being that He is righteousness, sanctification, redemption. That is the wisdom the world did not know. That is the hidden wisdom of God He will talk about in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians. If you remember the words we read in Romans 5, sin was in the world. He'll say, I did not know sin unless the law said. Right? Romans 5 tells us sin was in the world, but it was not imputed. Sin is not imputed where there is no law. See, Paul says he did not know lust. Doesn't mean lust was not present as the internal condition. Basically, he's saying there was never a contrast to that brought. There was nothing that posed the picture of something absolute perfect that I could look at and see something contradictory to my own nature. And that's what the law was. That sin would be seen to be exceedingly sinful. When Paul saw that lust, covetousness, concupiscence, now those words are the same word. The root word is lust. It's the same word in the Greek. It was something God presented as contrary to His perfect and divine nature. Paul was made aware that those things, the lust and covetousness, was not contrary to his nature, Paul's nature. So this exposure that was brought was a means to present to man the only true means of deliverance from such a state of internal contradiction. And that was to come to and receive the life of which the law testified. That's what the law was for, to bring us to Christ. So that we would receive the end of the law, which is the righteousness of God. The end of the law, that is life Himself. The end of the law, which is perfection, embodied in one perfect man. So in all of that time, God is pointing them to this man. He is clothing them with the testimony and the garment of that man so He can deal with them unto the coming of that perfection. Until faith came, the substance, the evidence, until He came. Romans 3:19, verse 20 says this. This is from the Weiss translation. We know absolutely that whatever things the law says, it says to those within the sphere of the law, in order that every mouth may be closed up and the world may become liable to pay penalty to God. King James says guilty. Wherefore, out of the works of law there shall not be justified any flesh in His sight, for through law is the knowledge of sin. The law brought you to see that who I am is absolutely contrary to the picture the law presents. It exposes me, not because of what I do. Paul wasn't out drinking and cussing and all the things we look at as sin. He was trying to be righteous, but doing it within the framework of the wrong man, of the wrong life, of death. trying to bear the fruit of life in the context of death. And expose that as his state, even though he believed he was in a state of life because he was after God with all of his heart. And saw achievement and saw righteousness as far as he could determine righteousness to be. That's what he will say, and we'll get into it. I was alive without the law once. I assumed I had life until the law came, until the true understanding. And this is, I believe it's the Weiss commentary says this. I was alive without the law once, and he goes on to basically bring commentary. In the days of ignorance, when in this sense a stranger to the law, basically a stranger to the law's full intent. I thought it was intended for me to be perfect instead of knowing that the full intent of the law was a perfect man, another man altogether. And that to be delivered from my state of sin and to be, for this perfection to ever be realized, I had to be delivered from this marriage to one man, brought into another man altogether. Had to be delivered by death to one man, that I may be found in another, having not my own righteousness. In the days of my ignorance, when in the sense a stranger of the law's intention, I deemed myself a righteous man. And in such I was entitled to the life at God's hands. But when it says sin revived and I died, he goes on to commentate and says, I saw myself in the eyes of the law never kept, and a law never to be kept, as a dead man. Meaning he realized the incapacity of his own self, that he had no way at all to be this good, to be this perfect. In his mind, he believed he knew good and righteous and holy. But see, that was a manufactured definition from the minds of men who believed they were inspired of God or believed that they knew God. Now he is indwelt by, and he has seen in the revealing of life itself righteousness that no man could ever even imagine, inconceivable to the natural mind. Paul is presenting himself here in the same place as the wife that was married to the first husband. He's showing this in his own example. Bound to a law without any hope of deliverance. No matter how great the zeal and the effort toward bearing fruit contrary to the seed of that old man, the result is always the same: death. Inward state, in the inward condition, the inward state always overcomes and outweighs the outward performance. However, verse 8, Paul will now show that as one governed by the law of sin, it says, taking occasion by the commandment. This is verse 8. Wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law sin was dead. He says the same thing basically in verse 11. We'll get into. Sin taking occasion by the commandment deceived me, and by it slew me. He will show that the commandment was utilized as a means to achieve perfection and righteousness. But see, we do the same thing today. I mean, we do it as Christians because we're ignorant of righteousness who is in us. So we're still Basically, performance theater, trying to perform and trying to be and trying to do, instead of just knowing who He is and living in the acknowledgement and in the acknowledgement of the government of the life that is present. And all that we do out from that realization still doesn't demonstrate perfect righteousness. We do it as those who are beholding perfect righteousness. We don't do it to achieve it. We do it as those in whom perfect righteousness lives. And we convey to others their need to come and see the man we are seeing, not see in me that man. So the commandment was utilized by the flesh. We'll look here in a moment. There's a commentary I have that talks about that. When the letter, the oldness of the letter, he says there in verse 6 of Romans 7, but when the letter is applied to the flesh, when the words of truth are made applicable to the man in whom no truth is found, sin and death is always the result. No matter how perfectly played out the letter may be. Remember Matthew 5 again. The internal makeup is what actually determines all things. The righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees is not a righteousness you finally achieve. It's the righteousness that He is. That is why Paul, after the knowledge of that exceeding knowledge of Christ comes into his heart, he says, there's an exceeding greatness to this one. And I desire to be found in Him, not having my own righteousness. The righteousness that was of the law, the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. I have found the exceeding righteousness. I want to know Him. The Wuest Word Studies says in verse 8 that the sin taking occasion. It says the same word in verse 11 when we get to that. Taking occasion. And he writes that it's emphatic, expressing the true relation of the law to sin. The law is not sin, but sin found occasion in the law. He says the verb here for occasion means to make a start from a place. It's a starting place, a base of operation. The origin, cause, the occasion, or the pretext of a thing, the means with which one begins. Here, he goes on to say, the law is represented as furnishing sin with material or the ground of assault. So basically, here's what sin does. Here's what the lust that is in us, again, the lust of the flesh, lusting against the spirit. The sin that is in me looks at the commandment, and this is what Paul, a man under the law, not a Christian, a man under the law, looked at the law, looked at the words, and the lust that's in him, the nature, the sin that's in him, used the material found here as a launching pad to produce his own spiritual goal and end, to produce his own result. This gave him ammunition. This fed him, fed his ego. That was not the intention of the law, but that is the utilization of the law by this man. Sin, death. Taking unto myself, lusting after an inheritance, a reality that doesn't belong to me, but belongs to another. That's basically what Paul was governed by, such a nature, such a life that is actually death. And he used these words as ammunition. We still do that. We can still do that. We can still live as those who are ignorant of the life in which all spiritual reality is fulfilled, embodied, and bestowed in grace in us, and still try to do the performance and make it happen. And it's the lust of the flesh still. Instead of knowing, allow the Spirit of God to make known what He has in grace fully provided. In this new marriage to another man. The law is represented as furnishing sin with the material for assault. It is the fulcrum of the sin. And it took the law as a base of operation. Romans 7 and 8, this is from the Young's Literal. Thou shalt not covet, and the sin, having received an opportunity through the commandment, did work in me all covetousness. For apart from law, sin is dead. We'll look at that in our next class. Apart from the law, sin is dead. But the Jewish New Testament says this is in verse 8 too. Apart from the Torah, sin is dead. This is both an outward application of and an inward parallel to the principle. Where there is no law, there is no violation. The outward application is that the Torah, as a species of law, this is the Jewish New Testament commentary, creates violation even though it is holy. See that, I wrote that down to try to say this, or I copied it to say this. The law did not cause sin. The sin that governed man used the law to try to produce perfection, what is not sin, righteousness, holiness. And because of the nature of man, not the outward things done by that man, but the inward condition, sin was always the result. Death was always exposed. Even though that death looked righteous and looked holy outwardly. Paul would say this and further in this. He says, when I tried to do the good of the law, evil was still present. The life determines all things. The seed in you determines all things. Nothing you do. This man could have, and he says he was, everything perfect. Everything he did, what the law said, did it to the T. Didn't matter. Man was void of the life of the man of whom the perfect law spoke. The only answer, the only true deliverance from that state was to receive the life of another, be married to another man, so that fruit that is acceptable unto God, fruit glorifying God, could actually finally be the result. And that fruit is not something you produce, but it's the person of Christ who is in you. So this is Paul giving his example, and we haven't really gotten too far into it. But we'll begin there. In verse 9, in our next class, we'll get into more of his personal example I hope I'm not confusing you. I hope I'm trying to make as much sense as I can with the limited words I have. We're talking about in Christ a life without sin, a salvation without sin. That's what we've come to. Salvation without sin. Because we are partakers of the life in which righteousness is perfectly found. That's who lives in you. And that's the one the Spirit of God is desiring to make known and show and reveal in you. That we may know salvation apart from sin, righteousness apart from the law, righteousness apart from man, defined in another altogether. All right, we're done tonight. Thanks, guys, for your patience. Thanks for listening. We'll pick up here next time. Amen.